Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another beautiful day in Western Asia. So today we will be doing a bit of review and a lot of new stuff. So we'll return back to the Hittite Empire for a little bit, just to look at a couple of the art objects that they had, and just kind of situate ourselves into back into Western Asia, I suppose. So the Hittites vied for control over Anatolia with the Mari, the Mitanni, and the Assyrian states. So up in Anatolia here, which is kind of present-day Turkey. And eventually they succumbed to the Assyrians and Phrygian states. The Phrygian states were located up kind of in the northern part of Anatolia, kind of near the Black Sea area, and basically left a small, kind of a smattering of small city-states left to vie for power for themselves. Now, two very, very interesting art objects that come out of the Hittite Empire are these two very small, roughly hand-sized cast copper alloy instruments. So the first is this so-called standard with two bulls flanking a stag. And this is really a masterpiece of copper casting. You can really see the amount of detail that went into creating the mold in order to produce this cast. Particularly pay attention to this sort of spiral type structure here that creates a loop around these two bulls and this magnificent stag in the center. And just look at the detail that is present within the antlers. That's all these individual little horns within the antlers, and the eyes each have these small little kind of little divots that are representative of the pupils. You can even see that the nostrils have been placed into this cast copper. Now, this really is a wonderful example of what can be done with casting alloys. And this was perhaps used as a quote unquote standard for for these chariots. So you'd have the main chariot and then the yoke and then the horses. So this probably sat on the yoke as a type of ornamentation, or perhaps as some sort of apotropaic or ritual religious aspect to it. And the sistrum, which is right over here, is essentially a rattle or a maraca. These vertical elements are loose and would shake on these horizontal bars here and create a rather raucous noise. And we get its name sistrum from its Roman counterpart, which was also used in rituals. And just notice that with both of these, that there is a very intense interest in animal representation. And of course, we can compare this with the lion and the Sphinx gate from Hattusha. And there is a deep interest in depicting these animal forms in various guises and aspects that is very much being explored here. Now, this slide is for your information, just to kind of situate yourself within the time period that we're looking at. Some important points are Hattushili, the king during the Old Kingdom of the Hittites, and he founded, I don't know why that changes, the foundation of Hattusha. So he founded this major imperial center, and we see during the reign of Mursili I, the sack of Babylon, which also marks the end of the Middle Bronze Age in the Near East. And with the coming of the Empire period in the Late Bronze Age, we see a massive expansion of the Hittite state into Syria with the conquering of modern-day Aleppo and Carchemish. And we also see the Battle of Kadesh versus Ramses II of Egypt, And we have, this is the reason that the Battle of Kadesh is so wonderfully interesting, is that it's one of those battles that we have information from both sides. We have the Egyptian viewpoint of the battle, and we have the Hittite viewpoint of the battle. And we'll get a little bit more on how we know about the Hittite side in a little bit. And during the 1210 to 1175, we see the abandonment of Hattusha, which comes along with kind of the fall of the Hittite state. So looking at the site of Hattusha, you can see that it is located within a very diverse topographic landscape. Many undulating hills and cliffs, an easily defendable position for a city to be in. And here we're looking at the main citadel, which its nickname in Turkish is Büyük Kale. And you can see how the walls and the buildings conform to the landscape. The amount of engineering prowess that went into this site was absolutely incredible. And just like a lot of the cities that we're going to see throughout this lecture, and as we've seen before, we have kind of a main citadel, which is for the royal precinct. We have religious precincts, and we have kind of the average citizen precincts. So this delineation of the town into these individual structures. Now looking at the citadel, so the royal precinct of Hattusha, this is a slide that we've seen before. We see just how expansive the city was. And we'll see that we have the Unterstadt, the German for the lower city, which is where the main temple and religious precinct was. We have Büyük Kale, which is the main citadel, so the royal portion, and the upper city, which is where the kind of the citizens would be gathered. And of course, we have the Lion Gate and the Sphinx Gate, which we discussed on briefly. And these are strong guardian figures. They protect the king and the citizens from external forces. And they also show the king's power to be able to control these strong and mighty forces of nature. And particularly with the Sphinx Gate, it shows just how powerful the king was, the Hittite king was, in order to be able to control these mythical creatures. And that kind of comes along with this idea of divine kingship, where he is given the kind of aegis of the divine in order to be able to rule his empire. And he shows this through controlling these mythical and real creatures. And pay particular attention to this use of the guardian figure through these gateways, through these entranceways, because this is going to come up definitely much later on. And as I mentioned before, this was slowly abandoned during the 1200s BCE, and this was part of the wider Bronze Age collapse of the Bronze Age. So we see basically throughout Western Asia and the Levant a gradual collapse in governmental structures that presages the coming of the next Iron Age and new developments in rule of Western Asia. So looking a little bit more closely at this citadel, this is essentially, I'm going to be using the term citadel. It's a technical term, you might have heard it before, but essentially it means a fortified city within a city. Generally, it is a royal administrative quarters that is set apart from the rest of the city via a protective wall. And if we look at this, we see that we have large open courtyards with administrative and residential courtyards and residential quarters, all sort of kind of included into this singular structure. And now if we pay attention to point D on the site plan, so that's this right here, and indicated by the red arrow, we see something we've seen before. This is the hypostyle hall. And if you don't remember, this is basically a forest of columns placed regularly to support a roof. And we saw this in Egypt used quite heavily, and it's something that we're going to see very much so continued into the Achaemenid period, which we'll get to, I believe, next week. And this is a style that's basically used until wide span vaulting is perfected. It is basically the only way to produce very large rooms. And the hypostyle hall becomes a room that is very much associated with kingship. It is a way for the king to sit within this grand room with these massive columns supporting a massive roof. And it is very much a way for them to show their power. And as we'll see later on with the Assyrians, they use this hypostyle hall to their advantage through the very fabric of the building materials. Looking to the lower city, so the religious precinct, there is the great temple of the storm god, which is a wonderful name. It sounds absolutely amazing. But that is this structure here, this number 1. And located all around the main temple structure are these archives and storage rooms, which are essentially used to store these offerings, administrative tablets, and temple treasures. And a lot of these were stored within these large ceramic jars, of which, interestingly enough, we see a similar type of these jars at Cretan and Mycenaean palaces. So that kind of talks and signifies a larger pan-Western Asian Mediterranean culture of religious practice that we're starting to see emerge here. And what's really fascinating about this is that a massive amount of cuneiform tablets were found within these archives, and in particular, one details a peace agreement with the Egyptians after the Battle of Kadesh. So we have, as I said before, kind of this multiple viewpoints into the history of this major battle. And normally it's said that history is written by the victors. Well, it just so happens that both sides, the Hittites and the Egyptians, thought they were the victors, so they wrote their own histories of the Battle of Kadesh, which is what makes it really so fascinating. And if you look at the site plan here, you can see that we have an open courtyard surrounded by these small subsidiary rooms, and which is kind of the function of the cult space itself, as to where we have an open courtyard and all of these rooms. And you may be able to make a comparison with some of the palatial architecture that we've seen before and we're going to see again. So we're kind of having this cross architectural use of religious and imperial architecture, as to where they start to almost mean the same thing and have those same connotations. A bit of review of the Elamites. This is roughly the same time that we're seeing with the Hittites up north. And they occupy southern Iran and the eastern Mesopotamian lowlands. And they participate in the larger Mesopotamian tradition of kingship, architecture, and culture. They're very much integrated into this larger cultural mixture that we've talked about before in the previous lectures. Now, two important sites of the Elamites are Susa up in the Mesopotamian plain, those eastern Mesopotamian plain, and Anshan, which is in the Iranian highlands, the Zagros mountain range. And the new royal city, Al-Untash-Napirisha, was located about 40 miles south of Susa, right in here. And we'll get a little bit more to this site in a bit. But as the kingdom starts to rise, the Elamite kingdom starts to rise, they come from Anshan and conquer the city of Susa. And they take on the royal title, King of Anshan in Susa. And this is an important thing to remember because we're going to see the same title used again, basically 500 years later. So definitely remember this. And as we talked about when during the Akkadians, these are the fellas that took the stele of Hammurabi, so Hammurabi's Law Code, the stele of Naram Sin, and the Sargon stele, where these were all essentially brought to Susa, and basically they reappropriated them and brought them to for their use as their own power. So looking at Al-Untash Napirisha, as I said, it's about 40 miles south of Susa, and is located on a strategic point on the main road leading into the Iranian highlands. And essentially it was located for them to be able to control movement of goods and people from the Mesopotamian plain up into the vast expanse of the Iranian highlands, a very important site. And the city, oddly enough, was never finished. It essentially was abandoned, and nothing really happened with it after a major flourishing under Untash Napirisha. And the central ziggurat, colloquially known as Chogazambil, was basically the main focal point of the city, and it survives today up to a height of 25 meters. And we have definitely seen these ziggurats before over at Uruk and Ur and Babylon, so they're definitely participating in the same type of religious aspect that we're seeing over in the Mesopotamian plain. Looking a bit closer at the city with this topographic plan here, we see those delineations with the city walls. We have this outer wall, which would hold on to, where the citizens would be located, so the standard citizens of empire. We have the royal quarter, which is up in the citadel here with all of the palaces, and we have the temple structure, so this temenos, which is enclosed within two separate walls. And within the temenos were temples dedicated to multiple deities. And the primary deities were Inshushinak, who is the main Elamite deity, and Naparisha, who is the chief deity of the highlands in Elam. And then we also have secondary deities who are associated with those two. So we have Ishnikarab and Kiririsha. And what's really interesting here is that the addition of Napirisha and Kiririsha of these temples at a later date suggest that the Elamite kings were trying to strengthen their ties with their highland neighbors to the east of Susa. So by bringing in their gods, they were essentially incorporating them into the Elamite culture. And as something that we will definitely see more of is the palatial district featured 8 tombs below Palace 1, so the so-called Hypogeum Palace. And unlike other Elamite sites that we know of, where they buried full intact bodies, the tombs here contained only one skeleton per tomb with multiple cremations around them. So they added cremation burials to these sites, and it's very different to what we have seen with other Elamite sites, as from what scholarship knows. So looking a little bit closer at the ziggurat itself, the corners were oriented directly to the cardinal points, so north, south, east, west. And we see a very typical ziggurat type formation, although this time the lowest course of the ziggurat, so that very bottom basically piece of the cake, was actually open from the inside. So this entire bottom layer had storerooms in it, in which multiple things were stored in. And in fact, the excavators found massive stockpiles of baked brick, bitumen, and plaster, in addition to a large trove of faience doorknobs and faience tiles that were stored in this level. So that suggests that the site was continually being renovated and a lot of money was put into its upkeep to have these building materials on hand in order to replace any sort of broken section right away. And that also suggests that they were looking to build more parts of the temple, even though it was abandoned. And the this main structure of the ziggurat has a mud brick core, so just bricks that were dried in the sun for until they're hard enough to stack, and surrounded by a 2-meter thick wall of baked bricks. So this 2-meter wall is resistant to the weather, and which is why it survives in such a great state of preservation. And interestingly enough, every 11th course, so every 11 courses of bricks, there is a brick inscribed with a dedication of the ziggurat by Untashna-Pirisha to the Lord of Susa in Shushanak, so that primary Elamite deity. So looking on to the Assyrian Empire, which we discussed very briefly in our last lecture, it was founded out of the wreckage of the fall of the Akkadian dynasty and the third dynasty of Ur. And they essentially functioned as an independent empire until the Mitanni sacked Assur and they became a vassal state. Essentially, the Middle Assyrian period saw the reemergence of the Assyrian state with a conquering of surrounding empires. They brought back the power of Assur into Anatolia, Upper Mesopotamia, and the Levant. And then we have a brief kind of interregnum period of about 100 years, and the Neo-Assyrian period, which was started under Adad-nirari II and Ashur-Nasrpal II, that expands deep into Mesopotamia, Elam, Media, and Egypt. They became a superpower in the Middle East. And they fall, essentially, the Neo-Assyrian Empire falls at the coming of the Babylonians in 609 BCE with the fall of Nineveh, that Nineveh is basically completely sacked. Basically, the Middle Assyrian Empire, just to kind of situate ourselves into the wider chronology, they existed during the same time as the Battle of Kadesh. And they were trying to play against their great enemies, the Hittite Empire, in trying to work with Egypt in order to gain more land for the Assyrians. And that, unfortunately, for the Assyrians doesn't work out. But eventually, when the new Assyrian Empire comes, they completely conquer Egypt. So the main part of the Assyrian Empire is centered on the upper Tigris River, so with that orange circle, as you see on the map. And it reached its greatest extent during the Neo-Assyrian period. They conquered basically all of Mesopotamia, a lot of Anatolia, so the former Hittite states, and down deep into Egypt. And they install a puppet governor in Egypt who is under direct supervision of the Assyrian kings. And what we're seeing is, with this Neo-Assyrian period, is a massive amount of city foundations, which are a sign of a good king. As we talked about in the Egyptian Empire, essentially they have these, being one of the parts of being a good king is founding cities, building things. And this is exactly what the Assyrian kings did. So some of them that we're going to look at are Assur, or Ashur. You'll see it has many different names, but this is a very old Assyrian city, so all the way back to the old Assyrian period. And multiple rulers had investments here. Kalhu, which is also known as Nimrud, was greatly expanded by Ashur-nasirpal II in the mid 800s BCE. We have Dur-Sharukin, which is also known as Khorsabad, which was greatly expanded by Sargon II in the 700s, the late 700s. And we have Nineveh, which was, of course, the city that was sacked by the Babylonians when was greatly expanded on by Sennacherib in 668 to 627 BCE. And these are all located up on the upper Tigris area. And that's where we see the main amount of Assyrian foundation. Now, one architectural term that I want you to be aware of is this so-called Bit Hilani style. This is a style that we see particularly in the Hittite states and the Assyrian time periods, and essentially it is a type of palace design characterized by an entrance portico or a loggia. And this is essentially a columned portico that fronts the entrance to a building, this large open space that has these kind of these massive pillars holding up the roof. And you'll notice these lovely little faces on these creatures here. They look a bit, the outside ones look a bit happy, and this one looks slightly scared or concerned. So Ashur was one of the earliest Assyrian cities, and I don't know why it changes like that. I have to check that out. And essentially, during the Middle Assyrian period, under Ashur-nasirpal II, the capital was moved to Kalhu, but Ashur still retained a great deal of importance to the Assyrians. And below the palace, which is indicated by the red arrow here, there were we have 5 royal tombs located underneath the palace. And some of these here, of the 5 that were excavated, we only know 3 who are interned here. So Ashur-bel-kala, Ashur-nasirpal II, and Shamshi-Adad V. And this is similar to what we saw at Chogozambil and some of the other sites like Uruk and Ur, where we have these royal tombs located directly in the royal precinct itself. And a random phrase of the day is the average mastodon was 2.3 meters tall. And we will return to Ashur in the Parthian period, so much later on in the semester after the second midterm, who built a great deal of palaces down in the new city and some parts in the old city. But just to orient yourself here, we have this massive temple precinct here with the main ziggurat next to the palace, another temple here, and this large circuit wall, and this Akitu temple, of which we will talk more about during the Babylonian period, particularly with the Akitu festival. So looking at just a little bit of some of the kind of interesting bits of Ashur, during the Middle Assyrian period, we see a great deal of palace foundation. So underneath this palace here is where those royal tombs were. You can see that we have a reconstruction of the Ishtar temple. Here you notice the very large walls with these massive gateways, and the interest in ziggurats, which were essentially something that we've seen so many times before. And of course, here is a picture of a ziggurat. Now, what's really fascinating about this ziggurat is it's basically the same form as what we're seeing in southern Mesopotamia, only this time being deployed in a distinctly Assyrian context. So the ziggurat still maintains a very important aspect to religious culture, and we see the Assyrians borrowing this religious architectural form from the southern Mesopotamians. Now, looking at another city, so Kalhu, also known as Nimrud, was essentially founded by Ashurnasirpal II in the 9th century BCE. And this is located about 20 miles south of modern Mosul on the Tigris River. It was, as all of the other cities that we've seen, it has this residential, the administrative, industrial, and ritual districts all contained within the main circuit walls. And the citadel contained all of the inner workings of empire. And you see that here at this northwest palace. Now, we can compare the Northwest Palace with something we saw in the last lecture, which is the palace at Mari. Notice how we have these this use of these interlocking courtyards and interior rooms that are basically all organized all around these different structures to create a way of essentially having this kingly architecture. It's something that we see time and time again, and it's something that we're going to continue to see, is this use of interior rooms around these open courtyards. It's a very much a royal style that is being deployed in different empires. It's the prestige architecture. Now, one very interesting fact is that Mari, those images that we talked about, were painted on a flat ground. So it was the fresco technique. But at Nimrud, or Kalhu, the images were low relief and then painted. So we have a new understanding of artistic space as it relates to architecture. And this rather lovely reconstruction by the excavator Layard in 1849 shows just how fancy it would have been and just visually stimulating it would have been to be in these palaces. And what we see with these are basically two types of reliefs. We have these narrative reliefs, which show successful campaigns, construction projects, so narratives of historical events that happened. And we also have these programmatic scenes. So a prime example of this would be the royal hunt. So they're not scenes that show a specific historical event, but scenes that essentially replicate a continued action, that are kind of the icon of an action. And what we really need to be thinking about here with these reliefs is basically the same as what we saw in Egypt, as to where these images have a certain power to them, a certain kind of continuation of an action. We're seeing the same type of thing here in the Assyrian palaces as we saw over in Egypt. Now, this is just for your information, another interesting interpretation of the palace, especially the throne room. But what's really fascinating here is we have within the Assyrian context this introduction of these guardian figures known as lamasu. And these are these composite bull, eagle, taloned man creatures. So kind of like that human-headed bull that we saw in the last lecture, a very similar type of thing here. And as this quote says from the palace, Ashurnasirpal changed the ancient mound of Kalhu, and a palace of boxwood, mulberry, cedar, cypress, pistachio, tamarisk, and poplar he adorned and made glorious. And this is basically showing that Ashurnasirpal is essentially creating a microcosm of his empire in the very structure of the palace. So he's using the wood from all extents of his empire to construct his palace. It's basically a way for him to show that he not only controls the people of these lands, but he controls the very natural resources that are fundamental to life in these lands as well. And he takes all of these natural materials from all around his entire empire and places them into a single palace to basically recreate his empire in small scale at the palace itself. Looking at these lamassu in more detail, they impinge upon the viewer's experience. So they are these imposing figures, and they transfix you with their sight. They have a power of their eyes. And as we talked about, like with the Tel Asmar figurines, and the idea of vision back then was that you would shoot these beams out of your eyes, and so too with the lamassu. They would be watching you. And what's really fascinating is that they seem to always be looking at you no matter where you stand in relation to them. And I tested this at the Louvre, the British Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum, and it really does happen. They always seem to be looking at you. If we look closer at the face, we see that it draws heavily on this pan-Mesopotamian precedent, this angular unibrow, this well-defined nose and eyes. We've seen this before at Uruk. It's very much something that is within this same artistic repertoire. Now, we can also look at the headdress, so this kind of horned headdress, something very common. We've seen this with the Akkadian reliefs, and we're going to see this continue on with the Assyrian reliefs. Now, those of you who are observant may notice that this lamassu has one too many legs. It has 5 legs in total. And the reason for this is the Assyrians were interested in depicting these perfect views. So one from the front and one from the side. And that shows that we have the one from the front is this idea of the guarding lamassu. So just as we saw with the sphinxes being laying down, same type of thing is that it's the guarding attitude. It's guarding the king from any sort of evil that might befall him. And then we have the striding attitude from the side, where you have the basically that it is striding forth. And that's the conquering attitude of the lamassu. So going forth and conquering with the king. And we see both an active and a static scene combined into a singular image with these lamassu. So it's a very new way of thinking about how art is created and how specific narratives are portrayed. And of course, you may be thinking, we can compare this to the Sphinx Gate or the Lion Gate at Hattusha. And yes, it is very much the same thing, as to where we have this, essentially we have this use of a guardian figure, this fantastical beast, to show that the king can control these divine magical creatures and the real world. Looking then to some of these reliefs that are within the palace, notice here that we have Ashurnasirpal II seated on his throne with these 2 eunuchs attending to him, with a minor deity standing behind offering blessing. And he is being offered by the front eunuch a little bowl of wine to refill his cup, and the back eunuch has his bow. So a very traditional symbol of Assyrian kingship is the bow and arrow. And notice that we have this small minor deity with these with the double horn instead of the triple or quadruple horns. So that's how we know he's a minor deity. And the reason we know that these 2 attendant figures are eunuchs is because they're beardless. So because they have been castrated, they no longer have the ability to grow beards. And this is an important aspect for the Assyrians. So just like Naram Sin in the Akkadians, the beard is that symbol of power and kingly might. And the eunuchs don't have that. However, they do have that extreme musculature, that 0% body fat musculature. So they're still portrayed as these strong individuals, but they're not as strong as the king himself. Now, if we look a little bit closer at the king's throne, we can see that he is seated upon this small little ottoman or platform for his feet, so this little footstool. And this is the kind of the same connotation that we saw in ancient Egypt, as to where the king is above the mortal plane, and he is above even the minor deity, and he is kind of this mediator between God and man. Now, also look at how the text occupies certain surfaces and leaves other blank. And this adds a whole new dimension to the narrative capacity of the reliefs. It makes art text and text art, as to where there's this kind of this intermingling and almost confusion between these two specific mediums into a new narrative, as to how one reads the text, one also reads these the images in themselves. And we see the same thing going on here with this relief located behind the throne of Ashurnasirpal II. And this is a sort of pseudo-symmetrical relief. We have Ashurnasirpal reflected across the center line. So here and here we have Ashurnasirpal holding a mace in his left hand, something we've seen before, the symbol of authority, just like it was in Egypt, and making a ritual gesture of worship to a winged disc at the center top. So this sort of thumb underneath the pointer finger is very much something we're going to see continue again. It's a ritualistic symbol. And in the center, we have this tree of life motif. And it seems to be speaking to the fecundity, the fertility of the king given by the gods. So we have this sort of transference of the god giving life and fecundity to the king, while the king gives praise to the god for that fecundity, this reciprocal action. And behind, we have these two protective spirits, so just like the ones we saw before with their traditional horned headdresses, and they hold pails and a small globular objects, which are associated with this so-called fertilization of the date palm ritual, which is this part of kind of kingship renewal. And they give blessings to Ashurnasirpal. And again here, notice the interaction of text and image. How there's that slippage between reading the relief and the text, and which creates kind of this wholly new visual and narrative experience. Looking then to that winged disc, this is a very important symbol of kingship within the kind of Western Asian tradition. And this comes to be an incredibly important symbolism for the Achaemenid Empire, for their religious symbolism. And here we have the god Ashur or Shamash offering a ring, which, as we've seen with the Akkadians, is very much a long enduring symbol of kingship in Western Asia. And this ring itself, which you can see here, becomes transfers away from this idea of the ring, which is then used to pull enemies along with the ropes, like we saw with Naram Sin, and starts to become kind of this diadem, so this wrap of cloth around the head as a symbol of kingship. Looking at, then to another type of relief, so away from these explicitly religious ones to war reliefs. Here we have the king Ashurnasirpal fighting on the front lines, and he's running down enemy archers who are traditionally placed behind the forward heavy infantry ranks. So here Ashurnasirpal has broken through the heavy infantry and is already on his way to scattering the enemy archers. And also notice that we have the winged deity here, this Ashur or Shamash, is helping in the battle, and he's replicating the same pose as Ashurnasirpal. So we have essentially this commentary as to where we have Ashurnasirpal as Ashur and Ashur as Ashurnasirpal. It's that we're seeing a divinely ordained war. Now, pay particular attention to this defeated enemy here with two arrows jutting out of his back. He is totally defeated, and he's about to be run over by Ashurnasirpal's chariot. Now, what's really fascinating about this is that the enemy of Ashurnasirpal is depicted with almost essentially the same muscular characteristics of the Assyrians. So Ashurnasirpal and the Assyrians are not defeating a weak, cowardly enemy. They're defeating a strong enemy, which shows just how strong the Assyrian state was. And if we look to the hairstyle of this defeated enemy, it's very similar to the hairstyles that we saw in Sumeria. So in the area around Sumer of that we've looked at before, we see this type of hairstyle. So we're seeing kind of this idea of realistic depictions being placed into art to be able to tell the story, not just with text, but with image as well. Now, if we look to some of the hunting reliefs, we see here the same type of motif being used to show the defeat of these lions. And we're seeing man and beast placed on the same level. These enemies were agents of chaos and harm to the empire, just as lions were. So there were these chaotic, evil creatures, and the enemy was just the same. And the essentially what this is showing is that the royal hunt and the royal war were one and the same. It was a means for the king to exhibit his prowess and supreme mastery over the land and the people in that land. And it was a way to show by the king being successful in war and hunting, he was able to show that he was divinely ordained and he had the favor of the gods. Now, this statue is absolutely fascinating. It is the only extant royal statue in the round from the Assyrian Empire. And this was located in the Temple of Ishtar to remind her of the king's piety. There's an inscription of 8 lines across his chest, which state his names, his titles, and that he conquered all the regions from the Tigris to Mount Lebanon and the Mediterranean. So thinking back to that other inscription that we saw, which talked about all the wood, here we have another depiction of it and another description of it with the text of the lands themselves. And now here he is depicted without his crown. So he's bareheaded, something that's very different. And he is holding a ceremonial sickle of a type that the gods use to fight monsters. So that are in some depictions of these Assyrian gods are using to fight these mythical monsters. And of course, the mace to signify his royal authority as the vice regent of the god Ashur on earth. Now, all of these visual clues lead us to seeing a depiction of Ashurnasirpal as priest, which is another important duty for a king to do, in addition to city foundation, hunting, and going on campaign. Now, one interesting ceremony associated with the statue is the so-called mouth opening statue. It was a ritual which brings the statue to life, quite literally, through programmatized cleansing. The statue after the ceremony becomes the king, not an image or simulacrum of one. It is the actual king. And the same ceremony was performed on cult statues. So we can, of course, make that same comparison to those votive figurines from Tel Asmar. We're seeing this same type of religious function where the image of the person is placed with the image of the god to engage in this sort of reciprocal religious action. And we see the same thing occurring these many thousand years apart, as to where the statue of Ashurnasirpal is engaging with the goddess Ishtar in order to remind her of the king's good works through his conquering of other lands. So looking to Dur Shadokin, Khorsabad, this was built, this was a site that was built on multiple different levels of the main palace here. So essentially, as one got deeper and deeper into the palace, they ascended higher and higher and higher, just as Ziggurat does. And essentially, the deeper into the palace you are, the higher you were, and the more important you were. And of course, like Nimrud, Mari, and Babylon, and all of these other Assyrian sites we've seen, we have multiple courtyards linked together with these kind of surrounding rooms, indicative of this pan-Mesopotamian implantation of prestige architecture. And you'll see again, we have this idea of these different precincts all placed within different city walls. We have the citadel itself, the religious precinct, the main precinct, or like the citizenry precinct, all throughout the rest. So again, just pay attention to the inner courtyards. This is just for you to gaze at and look at the amazing site plan of Dur Shadokin. Located within the palace was this lovely relief of Sargon II and the Crown Prince Sennacherib depicted on the left here. And what's really fascinating about this is that the toes of the two figures subtly curl over the edge of the relief's outer plane. So we have the plane of the relief here, and all of the carving is set back. So we have the main outer plane, and then we have the back plane, and the relief occurs between those two. But the toes, the little toes, curl out over the edge. And there's this slippage between the artistic world and the real world, that the reliefs start to encroach on the actual world. They start to in a sense, come to life and enter the space that they're in. Looking then to Nineveh, which is located quite near to modern-day Mosul, Iraq, it had existed for quite some time as a smaller settlement, but was expanded greatly under Sennacherib, so the crown prince that we just saw before. It featured 15 monumental gates, one of which is shown here, which pierced the circuit walls, and they held a population of around 120,000 people, making it the largest city in Western Asia at the time. And now the city was fed via a series of major aqueducts and canals, which brought fresh water from as much as 40 miles away. So the amount of imperial investment that went into sustaining this site is absolutely incredible. And the amount of money and time that went in to produce this site. Now, unfortunately, Nineveh was basically destroyed by ISIS almost entirely, which is an incredibly unfortunate thing. But as we'll see, especially in the coming slides, that this isn't something new, is that the destruction of cultural heritage, which I will play this video while I'm talking about it, but the destruction of cultural heritage is not something that is beholden to, say, just Islam or anything, or ISIS or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. Is that, as we'll see coming up, essentially the destruction of someone else's heritage is very much part of the culture of humanity. So the foundation of America did this with trying to erase Native American culture. Canada did it. Australia did it. Every country in the world has tried to erase other people's cultures to try and integrate them into their own society and remove their past. And so what we're seeing with ISIS is nothing new at all. It's very much within the broader kind of human culture, as unfortunate as that is. But as we move on to a little bit more about Nineveh, notice that we have the same idea of courtyards interlocked. We have, as one gets in deeper and deeper into the palace, there are kind of more secluded and secret corridors and courtyards that were all associated with kingship. Now, as I discussed just previously with ISIS, how the idea of destroying these other people's cultures, we see this very explicitly done in Nineveh. And we see these just beautifully elaborate, low relief and painted sculptures that were located all along the edge of this main kind of room here. And these are something that are known as orthostats. So orthostats. And those are essentially big blocks of stone that were used in construction that instead of their long side being placed, so here, let's pretend this is an orthostat. So instead of placing it like this on the wall, so here's your kind of wall running like this, instead of placing it like this, they're placed like this. And these were used primarily to slow the rise of this thing called creeping damp, which is the water in the ground itself will slowly draw through the stone in capillary action. And these orthostats were used to essentially protect the mud brick that was placed on top, because water and mud brick do not mix. It becomes clay. So these orthostats were a revolution in building architecture for the time, and they used them to quite great effect because they placed these brilliant low reliefs across them. So here we see some narrative episodes of construction, and this is a lamassu who is being brought to the palace at Nineveh. So we have the lamassu here on its wooden sled being dragged up a hill. We have these men pulling a lever down to kind of force it forward. And we have some soldier relief here, so some guards as they're moving it in. We have the essentially like the captains of these individual lines telling them what to do. Here is the king himself watching over the bringing of the monuments. And if you notice down here, we see these farmers with their irrigation, these lever action irrigation systems, so a little basket on the end of a weighted pole, as they're bringing water up for irrigation across multiple terraces. So not only are we seeing the supreme royal act of construction, but we're also seeing a continuation of that fertile king symbology, is that he brings fertility to the landscape. So this idea of this irrigation is kind of mimicked by the lush landscape of the hills above. And there's this commentary on all of the acts of kingship here. Another example is we're starting to see this kind of narrative and programmatic aspect mixed together. So we have this continuation of the similar iconographic elements. So the workers, the ropes, the lever, the lamassu, all placed into new positions. So a continuity of narrative using these programmatic iconographic elements. And what's really absolutely amazing with this is we have a man right here placing in, we have two men here placing a wedge below the lever to give it a little bit more leverage to push forward. We have these guys here are jumping up to grab the rope, and just the amount of real detail that is placed into these reliefs is absolutely just fascinating to see. So of course, I talked about the destruction of cultural heritage, and we see that with these Lachish battle scenes. And these are narrative scenes in the Southwest Palace at Nineveh that depict essentially every facet of war against the kingdom of Judah, from the marshaling of the Assyrian army to their march. we see refugees, prisoners, executions, the army fording rivers, and laying siege to Lachish. And they all end in a programmatic display of Sennacherib's absolute power over the world. And the detail on the left, I spoke a little bit about how hyper-realistic these depictions were. And we see a hairstyle that is common to Judea at the time. And these are two enemies being flayed alive by the Assyrian soldiers. And being flayed alive is essentially they remove your skin from your body. And you can see that we have their rib cages here with the muscles just exposed as they're pulling the skin off of their bodies. And you can see that they have the pieces of the skin here. And while two little children watch, so there's just this great deal of narrative specificity and brutal, gruesome aspects of war that were depicted in minute detail. And here, talking about that destruction of cultural heritage, when the Assyrians captured Lachish, they essentially completely destroyed it. And by destroying Lachish, they destroyed what made the Judeans Judeans. They removed all symbols of their culture in order to replace it with Assyrian culture. They tried to erase who the people of Lachish were in order to make them perfect Assyrian citizens and vassals. And now shown in this battle relief are the artificial siege rams constructed of a baked brick top with these large mounds of earth below. We see the siege towers placed rolling up and these siege battering rams. You can see the battering ram here to knock open the gates or knock down a wall. And the soldiers themselves are climbing all of these ramps up into the walls of Lachish depicted here. And it shows not that we have the extreme moment of victory for the Akkadians. This shows a moment during the siege itself because the defenders of the walls are throwing down these lit torches to try and catch the siege engines on fire. So there's all of this action going on. We have the archers here shooting off and trying to knock some of the Lachish people off the walls. We have these archers here trying to defend themselves. We have siege ladders going up the walls. It's an incredibly visually complex and intense scene that is all constructed into one narrative. And you can see as the viewer kind of moves across this relief, their eyes move up towards the destruction of Lachish, and then they come back down again, seeing the same thing. And this all ends in the coming of the king, of Sennacherib himself. And here he is seated in front of his soldiers. Well, two eunuchs fan him to keep him cool as he watches over the destruction of Lachish. And just to the left of this image, so just off screen, are throngs of prisoners in the very process of being executed. So it's the ultimate victory over the enemy, the ultimate victory of Sennacherib over his enemy, over these enemy forces. And interestingly enough, Sennacherib himself, the destroyer of Lachish, had his face destroyed, perhaps during the Babylonian sack of Lachish, because essentially they came in and destroyed his face. So we see here a destruction of cultural heritage in and of itself. So that concludes today's lecture. Make sure that you answer the question as soon as you get done with this lecture. It has something to do with mastodons, so make sure you enter the timestamp there. And I will see you all on Monday. There should be a kind of a Canvas bulletin board type thing go up if you have any questions about this lecture, and I will throughout the week I will try and answer them. So have a good rest of your week. Bye-bye.